So Ari, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to be on here. It's really wonderful what you're doing.
I would actually like to start with why do you do this work? What brought you into this field?
Yeah. So, I feel like I have a different answer for that every day.
Okay.
But I used to think when people would ask me that, I used to think like, well, why wouldn't I want to do this? Like, it's just so interesting. But I mean, I think maybe part of it is that I grew up religious. I'm Jewish. I still care a lot about Judaism, but just in a different way. And there are a lot of sexual restrictions in Judaism, and so I think growing up with these things that are either that that are either forbidden or have different connotations than to the general society. It makes it, kind of becoming less religious and sort of forging my own path growing up. Um, I've always felt, in general, I feel a little bit like a Martian anthropologist on Earth, kind of interested in this society that's different from how I understood things growing up.
Mm,
And I guess sexuality is just a particularly interesting aspect of the world that I had a different lens for growing up, and
yeah.
um, and so I'm just always fascinated by that.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. So tell me why are we talking about compulsive sexual behavior or out of control sexual behavior and non-monogamy in the same conversation?
Yeah. So the short answer is thanks to Kathy Labriola, who's been doing this work for a very long time. Wanted to address this problem that is unfortunately continues to be pretty widespread, where people will hear about this idea of polyamory, open relationships, any version of a dynamic where you can be in more than one romantic or sexual relationship at a time. And people get that confused with what they call sex addiction, which at the SAT Project, a group practice I'm part of, we prefer to refer to it as either out of control sexual behavior or compulsive sexual behavior, because that's just less stigmatizing and more accurate
Right,
for what we're
right.
talking about. But this stereotype, this association is pretty erroneous.
Mm,
And so that's the biggest reason why we're talking about it. We're talking about it because people do have these two things completely conflated, and so it's important to be able to separate the two. And we're also talking about it because, just like everyone else, people in non-monogamous relationships can still deal with compulsive sexual behavior. So
mm.
it's still important for them, just as it is important for everybody, to be able to understand this and how it uniquely applies to them.
Yeah. All right. So from the outside, maybe somebody is consensually non-monogamous, the assumption might be they're sort of out of control. This is a sex addiction, or somebody might think if your partner brings it up, that's why they're bringing it up. They have this.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. People hear you're polyamorous or you're in an open relationship. Oh, it must be because you're a sex addict and you just can't get enough of that sex stuff, and that's why you've decided to open up your relationship. It can't possibly be for any other reason.
All right. So let's talk. But I do hear you that just because you're non-monogamous doesn't mean you couldn't have, right? Like there is some overlap, just like there would be in any population. So
Exactly. And so that's the other reason why I was so thrilled to be able to help Kathy with this chapter, because in the end of the day, I think it's one of the secondary impacts of being stereotyped is you have a label on you, a stereotype, and then you want to do everything you can to show that you aren't that. So I think a lot of polyamorous people and people in open relationships feel a lot of pressure to be perfect in their sex lives,
mm,
and that makes it harder for a lot of non-monogamous people that I work with to recognize and face if they do in fact have some compulsive sexual behavior.
yeah. Okay. So what are the important distinctions between, again, consensual non-monogamy and compulsive sexual behavior?
Okay, so there are four distinctions that I write about, and I base this on some thinking by Brown, Harvey, and Vigorito. But the first one is informed consent, right? These are all going to sound really basic, but
Yeah.
sadly, I see them much more often than I would have thought. And so when I say all these things, as basic as they sound, I mean them fully. So informed consent, meaning that everybody is aware of the relational dynamic, the agreement. If the agreement is that we're allowed to have sexual interactions with other people, but not enter any romantic agreements with other people without talking about it first, then that's the agreement. And if someone were to stray from that agreement, then there would no longer be informed consent.
Right.
So sometimes people will come to me and want to work with me on what they're calling a polyamorous relationship, and I come to find that their partner has no idea that they've been doing all of
Yeah.
this.
Basically, they're cheating, right?
Right, that they're cheating, exactly. And
Yeah.
so that's not polyamory or an open relationship. There's no informed consent. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a case of compulsive sexual behavior, but these are all just indicators, right? There's a
Right.
more likely chance.
Okay.
So another one is honoring values. So when I say honoring values, what I mean is, if you say that it's important to engage in safer sex, whatever that means, to engage in certain levels of protection from unwanted pregnancy, STIs, then those values are being honored. All too often, folks who consider themselves non-monogamous, who might also happen to have compulsive sexual behavior, just like single people who are dating might engage in these same exact problems, might say they care about a certain level of protection, but then when push comes to shove, that protection isn't being honored. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's compulsive behavior, but it's another indicator.
Yeah.
Then a
Yeah.
third one that I consider is mutual respect. So is that anyone being harmed from these interactions? And there are obvious ways in which that applies that are far too often crossed in both directions. Actually, we have some research indicating that just because of the increased dating exposure, people who are non-monogamous are more likely to experience sexual assault and other kinds of really harmful behaviors from their dating. But so any kind of exploitative behavior would be another sign that I would consider. And then finally, mutual benefit. Is everybody gaining something from this dynamic? And it could be pleasure, but it could be something else. Sometimes I might get a couple or a client where the dynamic is that one partner might occasionally directly participate in non-monogamous activities, but mainly just appreciates having more time to focus on work, and is happy that their partner has these other outlets for enjoying their sexual preferences.
Now, that's not to say there are never any struggles with this or challenges, I suppose, too, but at least there is benefit across the board.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's really important that you say that, because I think that a lot of people who are trying non-monogamy will feel this halo effect, like they have to be the perfect polyam individual, the perfect open relationship, because they're so afraid. There's so much stigma against people that are trying this, and so it's really important, I think, to normalize that. Just like people in monogamous relationships screw up all the time, it's the same for people in non-monogamous relationships.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that sort of leads into my next question about like, what else do people misunderstand about this? What are the myths or the, misconceptions or the stereotypes or something that you're having to address with people? I guess either whether they're exploring non-monogamy or they're watching it, noticing it in other people.
So there's different levels. So sadly, the most common ones that I encounter still are people confuse the term polyamory with polygamy.
Oh,
And believe it or not that long ago, I still saw that word polygamy being used instead of polyamory in a textbook.
wow.
Yeah. So that's the first thing is people will discuss with me polyamory, and in only like 10 minutes into the conversation will I realize that they think we're talking about a dynamic where men are allowed to marry as many women as they want, but not the other way around, and none of the other elements, other types of non-monogamy are being considered in the conversation. And then the other one, like you said earlier, is that it's not cheating. People will often get the two mixed up, cheating and non-monogamy. But beyond that, at another level, some of the other common stereotypes that I'll encounter, kind of along similar lines. One is that, and what I find interesting about a lot of these is that the stereotype kind of has a double-edged sword to both sides. In other words, what I mean is you link folks who are, so for example, there's a stereotype that non-monogamous people are all LGBT, as if that was a problem, right? So there's a stereotyping of everybody that's non-monogamous as LGBT, and then there's also a stereotyping of many LGBT folks as non-monogamous, as if either of those things would be problematic issues.
Right.
Another one is that all non-monogamous people are sex maniacs. All they want is sex, as if having a high sexual desire would be problematic. That happens to be incorrect. Many non-monogamous people are in fact asexual, meaning that they don't have a very high sexual desire, or if they have one at all. But some do like to have a lot of sex, just like a lot of monogamous people
Right.
do.
Right.
So that's another stereotype. Another one, interestingly, is there's this idea that non-monogamous folks must have really high rates of STIs. The data we have available so far doesn't show really any difference statistically. And if the studies we do have right now that have shown a difference have actually seemed to indicate that non-monogamous people have lower rates of STIs, which might be because of all the precautions and conversations around consensual non-monogamy. And finally, there's this other one that I've been thinking about lately, which is kind of like more of a positive stereotype that I think can also interestingly create problems, which is I'll often hear people refer to non-monogamous people as like more evolved, like they're on some higher plane. They're better people.
Right. As if
And
non-monogamy is like higher on the evolutionary scale, right?
Yes. Like these are people who've clearly reached a level of self-awareness that's beyond anybody else. And that's not to say that engaging in non-monogamy doesn't require people to grow. It absolutely does. But from what I've seen and from the research that I am aware of, non-monogamous people are just as human as anybody else. And I think that this can also be a harmful stereotype because it puts pressure on non-monogamous individuals to not be human, frankly, to not make mistakes or acknowledge the mistakes that they make.
Well, like you sort of said, the double-edged sword that also implies that, anyone who's monogamous is unevolved.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That's the other problem. And that can especially be a problem because, this is thankfully starting to be more of a topic of conversation, but it's not so unusual for non-monogamous people to end up in serious relationships with monogamous people. And that can be an incredibly challenging dynamic, but that doesn't mean it's not workable. And it doesn't help to have these stereotypes running around that non-monogamous people are so much better, because if you're monogamous in a non-monogamous relationship, there are a lot of unique challenges that you're facing.
Yeah. Well, that sort of leads into what you call the wrong CNM, consensual non-monogamy, right? Like
Yes. So what I like to call the wrong CNM. So instead of consensual non-monogamy, we're now talking about coercive non-monogamy. And unfortunately, I find this also all too common in therapy. I don't think that this is necessarily more common out and about, but in therapy, folks who are referring to themselves as non-monogamous will sometimes not realize that they're actually in more of a coercive dynamic. There might be words of consent being used, but sometimes what's really happening is an individual in a non-monogamous relationship feels really pressured. And for example, a way that I've seen this play out is sometimes I'll get men with this idea that they have to be brave, they have to be independent, and the idea of struggling at all with a non-monogamous dynamic runs counter to their ideas of bravery or masculinity. And when I see that, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be in a healthy, consensually non-monogamous relationship. But what I sometimes see is that when you really probe them, they don't really want to be, but they've kind of coerced themselves into a non-monogamous dynamic.
So this is where you've got one person who's basically monogamous and one who's not, right? And the monogamous person might be giving in or feeling pressured, or I'll do anything not to lose this relationship, or any number of things, right?
Sometimes. So we call that a monopoly relationship usually when that happens. But coercive non-monogamy also can happen in other types of dynamics like polyamory and open relationships. But it's just where either because of pressure on oneself or pressure within the dynamic, there isn't truly a consensual agreement. Somebody is either feeling pressured by themselves or their partner or partners to be in this non-monogamous dynamic when really they don't want to be. And the line between non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy and coercive non-monogamy can sometimes be a little gray, right? Because that doesn't mean that you're wrong or coercive just for wanting a non-monogamous dynamic when your partner doesn't. But sometimes people will jump into a non-monogamous dynamic before it's really been agreed to, and that could be another example of a more coercive CNM.
Yeah, and I'm sort of imagining, depending on how aware of this the non-monogamous person is, now we're bleeding into where maybe there's not really informed consent, or there's not really benefit for everybody, or some of the things you were listing as distinctions for compulsive sexual behavior. I mean,
exactly.
how does it start to show up if somebody in a non-consensual, all my words are getting twisted up. Consensual non-monogamous relationship. What are some of the signs that there's actually compulsive sexual behavior going on? Like how do those show up?
Yeah. So, I think one sign that I'd have to think about this some more, but I think one sign that I've often noticed is when things seem to be moving very quickly. So maybe there was a conversation or two about opening up at some point in theory, and then a week later, a partner finds out that her husband is going out with somebody new, or maybe someone was kind of on the fence and thinking about it, and then one day, without really having much time to think about it, he's being told by his partner that I've scheduled a date for tomorrow, and like it or not, I'm going. We can break up if you don't want this, right? So these are just some examples, and I want to be careful as I talk about all these things, because I don't want to leave the impression that this happens more often. These kinds of coercions happen more often in the consensually non-monogamous world, but it happens just like it happens in the monogamous world, so we have to be able to talk about it.
Right. But it's got this extra guise of, consensual non-monogamy over it. Almost, it seems to be, it would almost dilute our awareness of the coercion sometimes, because we're already talking about having sex with other people. So what's your problem?
Yes, exactly. That can be one of the detrimental effects to essentially co-opting the language of consensual non-monogamy when it's not really consensual, right? We're polyamorous. What's the problem?
Right.
It's not really polyamory, but if people are co-opting that word, it sounds above board.
Yeah. So where does it drift into like compulsive sexual behavior from something that is just either coercive or cheating? You know, how do you understand? I don't know, where do you draw the line? It's probably gray, but
Yes,
how do you
it's very
distinguish
gray.
compulsive sexual behavior from something like cheating or coercion?
So, oh, that's an interesting question. So you mean distinguishing? So compulsive sexual behavior on its own is not always harmful to other people, right? So
Right.
that's when I talk about cheating and coercion, these are examples of some of the detrimental effects, but quite often, probably more often than not, when I'm working with somebody with compulsive sexual behavior, it's not really harming anybody except for that person.
Yeah.
So we're talking about someone who's maybe single or in a non-monogamous relationship, so it's allowed, and maybe they're spending more money than they want to. Maybe they're not making enough time for things that are important to them. And oftentimes, what I see in non-monogamous relationships is people really value their partners. So they'll really go to extra lengths to make sure that they're not harming their partners, even if they do have some compulsive behaviors. But I think the distinction between compulsive sexual behavior and coercion is really is this something that your partner is just concerned about, right? In either case, in a non-monogamous dynamic, partners who love each other are probably going to be concerned about the compulsive behavior, even if it's not directly harming them. So, for example, maybe somebody in a relationship, monogamous or non-monogamous, is spending an awful lot of time each day watching porn. That's something that happens in a lot of monogamous dynamics as well, because
Right.
a lot of people don't consider that to be non-monogamy. Porn on its own isn't necessarily violating any relational agreements, but if you're spending a lot of time watching porn and you don't have time for other things that are important to you, or it's causing some kind of problem because of how much you're touching yourself,
Right.
for a couple of examples, then this might be an indication of compulsive behavior. But we would draw the line and just call it compulsive sexual behavior at that point because it's not directly harming anybody else,
Right.
right? Whereas if it's also, maybe going to the monogamous couple, I'm thinking of a few people I'm working with right now where their partners also didn't agree to the porn usage, right? So now we have something where there's a little bit of, I don't know if we would call it cheating exactly, but it's not exactly honest behavior, right? So
Yeah.
that might be a distinction. And so the same thing can happen in non-monogamous dynamics. It's just that now we're expanding it. It's not necessarily just porn or self-pleasuring, but it might also be with other partners. Maybe it's with sex workers. And so these wouldn't necessarily be harming anybody if everybody's okay with it, but it could still be compulsive. And so we still want to be able to talk about it. Is it a healthy behavior? Meaning, is it something that the individual feels good about, doesn't regret later?
Yeah. So in this chapter that you've written, I mean, is there anything you want to say about your model of understanding compulsive sexual behavior or your approach to treating it? I haven't read the chapter, so I don't know how much is in there, but
Yeah. So okay. And so just so the listeners can distinguish. So until now, we've been talking about a chapter that I just contributed to in Kathy Labriola's upcoming book, Love and Abundance. Her second edition is coming out, and so we've been talking about things that I contributed to her chapter on compulsive sexual behavior and consensual non-monogamy.
okay.
But then the chapter you're referencing now is
Okay. Two different chapters. I'm glad you clarified that because
different-
I didn't know that was two different chapters. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So the other chapter is something that I don't know when it will come out exactly, but it's going to be in the Handbook of Positive Sexuality. And that's going to be a chapter that's coming out on a model that I'm proposing for understanding and treating compulsive sexual behavior. Something that in the other two episodes, I got confused earlier because I thought you were referring to the two episodes with the SAP project, Mike and Sean. Something that we're talking about in those episodes is about how shame can play a really big role, sometimes a fundamental role in what drives compulsive sexual behavior. So that idea is something I really carry forward. I've learned, I continue to learn every day from Mike and Sean about this subject. But in this chapter, applying that idea of shame and how shame can play such a pivotal role in initiating and perpetuating compulsive sexual behavior. I developed a model where we really just try to understand these behaviors in a little bit more of a nuanced way. I based it on some models that are already available. But I think maybe the most interesting part that I'll talk about here is one of those models. Some of your listeners might be familiar with intuitive eating.
Yeah.
So that's an idea that I think really applies well for trying to address compulsive sexual behavior. Something we talk about a lot at the SAF project is how it's not really realistic or helpful to try to think about compulsive sexual behavior as something that you could just turn on or off, like a switch. It's really something that you dial down over time by addressing a lot of the underlying issues. And so that can be helpful by better understanding your story and your narrative and where this behavior comes from. But it can also be helpful to have some direct things to try, some direct behavioral interventions. And so based on the intuitive eating idea, where we're really thinking about, are you hungry when you eat, right? What purpose is food serving for you? Is it more of an emotional something? Is it more of a something that you're enjoying with other people? And so we want to think about sex in that way as well. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of fun with that.
That's a wonderful alignment between those two ideas. Like, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I like the two as some, like, whenever we're trying to understand sexuality, I think it could be helpful to take a step back and see how it would apply when we're talking about food, because these are two things that we can sometimes lose touch with. I know for myself, I often have a problem of eating when I'm not especially hungry, right? So we want to be able to look at that and talk about it. What is the real reason that you wanted to eat that thing? There's nothing wrong with that. We don't want to feel, but we want to look at the shame that might be felt underneath that as well. And the same often happens with sexuality, where we're not often, I think, especially because we don't often talk about sex in society, it's very easy for folks to lose touch with why they want to have sex on a given day, at a given time, a specific way.
Yeah. And then, like you're saying, if it's being driven by shame, right, that's something we'd like to interrupt. So
Exactly.
is there anything I didn't ask you about consensual non-monogamy that you had wanted to talk about?
I think you asked everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if we leave the listeners with a bottom line, these are two distinct things, and yes, they can happen in the same person, but not by default, right? So.
That's right. These are two distinct things, and as far as we know, the evidence I've seen would suggest that it's no more common among people in open relationships and polyamorous dynamics than it is among monogamous folks. If anything, if I had to guess which is more prone, I would probably guess monogamous folks, only because there's less conversation about sexuality in an average monogamous relationship.
Yeah.
But if you are non-monogamous, it's important to also ask yourself these very same questions. How do you feel about your sexual activity? Is it really something you're enjoying? Is it really something that you feel good about? And how is it impacting your loved ones? Is
Yeah.
it something that your loved ones feel good about? Or is it sometimes maybe getting in the way of things that are actually really important to you that you value more?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's something that all of us should be asking ourselves.
Definitely. So just tell people where they can reach you or find you online, or, how do people get in touch if they want to know more?
You can find me at arilewisTherapy.com. I'm also on the SAT Project website, satproject.com, satproject.com, and you can email me at ari@satproject.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is wonderful.